Okay, let's do this. Okay, good. Okay, so so today we'll be presenting about the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, 5th edition. The sequence of presentation will be me, Joel, and then Shafika, Joel again, and then followed by Joyce. Okay, so this is a little bit about what we're covering today. So what PVT is all about, and then we'll talk about the purpose of assessment, methods for data collection, as well as our personal experience. Okay, so Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the 5th edition, is also known as PPVT5. It is a norm reference test and it's individually administered. So what it does is that it measures the student's receptive vocabulary based on the words in standard American English. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test has been used for nearly half a century. It was first launched in 1959 by two pioneers in the field of special education, which is Lloyd and Leota Dunn. Yes, they are husband and wife. The PPVT became one of the most popular standardized tests to assess verbal intelligence. Of an individual. So it has been revised many times. The current form is the 5th edition, and it came out about in the late 2018. So vocabulary is a critical component of language, and this test is a great way to test vocabulary knowledge that is normally introduced in early life, right? So the test is verbally given, and it uses cards that contain about 4 pictures each. The test is intended to assess subjects aged about 2.5 to about 90 years old. Okay, so this test is a straightforward structure. It's quick, easy, and reliable, and it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete the test, even though there's no time restriction. So the test also helps to foster growth in language and literacy, and is designed to serve as a screening test for verbal ability. So how does it work? So you can see from the picture there. Examinee actually see a picture on an easel with 4 colored pictures. For each set, the examiner says a word, and the examinee respond by selecting one of the 4 picture that best illustrate the word meaning. So because the examinee is pointing to the appropriate item, the test require no reading, writing, or verbal language. Thus, it can be used for someone who is a non-reader and those without fluent verbal abilities. So with the data, it can help inform professional of the course of intervention needed should the child require additional support, right? As mentioned just now, PPVT can be used from the age about 2.5 to about 90 years old. So however, the target population are still kids between the age of 6 to about primary school students. So in Singapore, students are predominantly from mainstream schools and some from Pathlight School, which is a SPED school. So most of them experience literacy difficulty, and some with official dyslexia diagnosis. It can assess a person. It can assess the vocabulary of words that a person can understand when he or she hears the word. So therefore, it is a good assessment for many different types of special needs students. Okay, so if utilized on a school-age child, the PVT can estimate the child's scholastic aptitude. The test can reveal how high or low the verbal ability is and identify possible learning disability. The PPVT is also useful as a verbal intelligence test for people who with physical disability yet able to retain some functional visual and auditory capabilities. So it can also use to identify language disorder of children. And lastly, for children who suffer from emotional withdrawal or suffering from mental retardation or speech or reading problem. So this is a good verbal ability test. Okay, next I'll pass the time to Joelle.
Thank you, Dini. So as she has pointed out earlier, the targeted domains are towards the examinee's receptive vocabulary knowledge in standard American English. So these are the components of receptive vocabulary. Next slide. Yep. So you can see here that nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are all part of this vocabulary, which are different parts of speech of the children, and these are usually presented as image to test the examinees. At the same time, next slide, these vocabulary words are also made up of words that are, next slide, yeah. commonly used at home and in school, as well as they are being part of the daily speech, and they are also types of STEM vocabulary words. So STEM refers to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So by evaluating children's receptive vocabulary in these areas, their strengths and weaknesses of knowledge in this area can be identified, and thereby suitable interventions can be provided to bridge these gaps in this essential vocabulary. And also these vocabulary words are guided, in the next slide, are guided by this three-tier model, as you can see here, to choose the choice of words used in the test. So there are three tiers. Firstly, as you can see here, in tier 1, they are words that are typically learned through the home or community interactions that most students are expected to know upon entering school. In tier 2, these are high frequency words that are found in both oral and written discourse that can be found across a range of materials. And lastly, tier 3 are lower frequency words whose use is limited to specific content areas only. And on the other hand, STEM vocabulary words also tell us about the examinee's school and workforce readiness. And all this information are crucial for the qualitative analysis of the results of children's language ability. And next, Shafika will bring us through the purpose of the assessment.
Okay, so I will be talking about the purpose of assessment of the PPVT based on what the developer said. So according to the developer, the purpose of the PPVT is to actually measure the receptive vocabulary acquisition as part of a language evaluation across the lifespan of the examinee. So the purpose of this assessment is that it can actually contribute to useful information when assessing strengths and weaknesses in the specific domain of semantics, for example, word knowledge, as well as the general area of language development of the examinee. Next. So what kind of decisions can be made from the PPVT? So it's important to note that the PPVT is not an actual diagnostic tool, but it can actually be used to help in the formulation of the diagnosis of conditions and disorders that are related to language impairment. So after diagnosis, that's when the clinician, therapist, or teacher can actually help with come up with a treatment planning that's suitable for the child. So the PPVT can be used to assist with the different aspects of the treatment planning, such as early intervention, what sort of differentiated instructions that are needed for the child. Next. So what's the scientific evidence to show that the PPVT actually works? So I'm going to use a study that was done on a KKH program. It's called Mission I'm Possible. Short MIP. So what is MIP? It is actually a literacy intervention program for children who are at risk of reading difficulties. So Chong actually conducted a study to measure the effects of MIP. So what are the actual effects of on the developmental and literacy outcomes among preschool children after going through MIP? Next. So before they started MIP, they actually used the PPVT4 to conduct pre-assessments, pre-literacy assessments, and they also used the same PPVT4 to conduct another assessment after MIP. So they found that there was actually a significant improvement in literacy attainments as well as the receptive vocabulary of these children. So it shows that the PPVT actually aided the teachers or therapists to formulate the appropriate intervention for these children. Next one. So of course, with any assessment tool, it's not perfect, and there are several areas that can be reviewed. So the four main areas that I will talk about will be the cognates, limited measures of the PPVT, cultural bias that's present in the PPVT, as well as the lack of local versions. So what is cognates? So cognates is actually when examinees can speak two languages, so they have first language and second language. So they actually can use reference words from the first language to guess the meaning of unknown items in the second language, which is English. The second one, for limited measures, it's known that the PPVT only measures receptive vocabulary skills and does not include the expressive language abilities. For cultural bias, the majority of the normative sample for the PPVT are white, and we all know that the PPVT is only available in American English and no other English versions are available. And of course, there's not much local versions. It has been translated to certain languages, but not a lot. So not all languages have their own PPVT version. Next. So I'm going to talk more about cognate. What is actually a cognate? So cognate is actually a word that is related in origin to another word. So for example, the word brother in English sounds almost the same and has almost the same spelling as Bruder in German, which also means brother. So for example, a German child, when the examiner says, oh, point to brother. So when he hears the word brother, he goes, oh, it's like the same as Bruder. So maybe he doesn't even know what brother means, but he could point it correctly because he was using his language, his first language ability, right? So how does it actually help examinees? So cognates can actually facilitate second language acquisition and use. So learners will tend to assign the meaning of the new second language word that's similar to the meaning of their first language word. So this means there's actually a possibility of bias. Results from a study conducted by Luniska, Pichette, and Bellan showed that cognates actually exerted an influence on test performance. So the PPVT actually, the results should actually be cautioned because it's actually likely to favor examinees who speak a language with which English shares more cognates, like French, Spanish, German. Yeah. Next one. All right, so the PPVT is known to only measure receptive vocabulary. So what's a receptive vocabulary? It's actually a group of words that a person recognizes and is familiar to them. And because the PPVT does not measure expressive language ability, which can include speaking, gesturing, writing, facial expression, and vocalization, it might actually be, I guess, unfair to someone who has poor receptive vocabulary skills, but might be better with expressive language abilities. Next one. So the PPVT is known to contain some cultural bias. It's not very inclusive, so results and interpretations of those from different racial backgrounds should be exercised with caution because we all know that the normative sample of the PPVT is mainly white. And of course, it's only available in American English. And the PPVT does not take into consideration examinees who might speak other varieties of English. So for example, the word picture in America, right? So the examiner might say, okay, I'll point to a picture. A British person might not know what a picture is. So it's a jug, but the person doesn't know, okay, even though he or she can speak English, right? So there's a study conducted by High, Greenberg, and Morris also showed that there's a performance difference when it comes to ethnic minorities who take the PPVT. So why is there a performance difference? It could be attributed to the disproportionate representation of minority groups in the lower socioeconomic status, as well as, of course, there's always variations in cultural, linguistic, and social experiences of ethnic people. So a study done by them found that the PPVT is not actually a useful measure of receptive vocabulary for 229 struggling adult African American readers with isolated reading skills between 3rd and 5th grade. So definitely the results need to be taken into caution when testing children from ethnic minority groups. Next one. So there are very little local versions of the PPVT available. So, according to Haitana, Pitame, and Routledge, in order for a test to be considered unbiased, it must also measure culturally appropriate knowledge and utilize methods of testing that's suitable for people from different cultural backgrounds. So they actually conducted a study with Maori children from New Zealand. And, they found that the PPVT may actually be more appropriate when it's used as a measure of a child's stage of English language development, rather than an indicator of age equivalence, which is what the PPVT does. So in Singapore context, Sun and Ng actually, in their study, they actually found that the bilingual language assessment battery actually demonstrated strong reliability in the context of Singapore within the original norming sample. The BLAB is actually adapted from the PPVT tool. It's a standardized receptive picture vocabulary task that's been developed in Singapore. So I guess local examiners might consider using the BLAB instead of the PPVT. Yep, that's all I think. Yeah, so I will pass on to Joelle for the methods of data collection.
Thank you, Shabika. So the PPVT is tested by showing 4 pictures to the examinee, as you can see in this slide. So of which the examinee will point to the picture that best match the words spoken by the examiner. And because this test only requires the examinee to point to the appropriate item, it requires no reading, writing, or expressive verbal language and can be used with non-readers and those without fluent verbal abilities. So this instrument is strictly administered by only psychologists, speech language pathologists, early childhood teachers, and special education teachers with experience and training in standardized testing. And this test can be administered through pencil and paper or digitally. So after administering the test, the examiner will evaluate the scores. And as the test items are valid, back to the previous slide, please. The previous slide. So as the test items are valid for a wide range of people, the starting point of the test will vary for examinees of different ages. For example, like the 7-year-old children, they will usually start at the 50th item. Okay, the next slide. So this is about the recording of the data. So there are several items that are crucial to understanding how this data is being recorded. So during the test, this is what the examiner will be recording. Firstly, you will see that the basal item refers to the first 3 consecutive items in which the child achieved from the starting point. So in this example, you can see that item 10 is the starting point. You can see the start arrow there. And although the examinee had answered number 10 correctly, item number 11 was answered incorrectly, and therefore the test had to proceed backwards to item number 9. So until all 3 consecutive answers have been achieved. As you can see that the basal was achieved for items 8, 9, and 10. And once the basal has been established, the testing can then proceed forward, which in this case would be all the way to item 12. So the test will continue until the child makes 6 consecutive incorrect responses, and the last incorrect item will be considered the ceiling item. So this indicates that the following items beyond the ceiling items will be beyond the examinee's ability already, and hence the test will be stopped. So if the examinee did not attain 6 consecutive zeros in a test, the last test item will be considered the ceiling, and hence this happens especially for older examinees who begin at a larger item number. And the assessment is completed once a basal and a ceiling had been established. So next we'll look at 2 more other terms which will help us in our recording of the data. So during the recording, you can see here in this picture, it's a record form. The examiner will circle 1, 2, 3, 4 on the record form according to the answers pointed by the examinees, as you can see here. So the correct response are the numbers in red, while the incorrect response are numbers in black. And NR, yeah, you can see in the slide, refers to no response when the examinee does not provide a response. So as you can see here, according to the black numbers and the red arrows that I pointed it out, there are 2 errors in total. And another term that we need to know when recording the data would be the raw score. So the raw score refers to the number of correct items below the ceiling. And this raw score can be calculated by subtracting the number of errors from the ceiling item. So next slide. So therefore, how do we interpret this data will be through 2 methods, quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. So for quantitative analysis, the raw score will be tabulated to analyze the child's ability, and it will then be compared to the scores of the same age peers to obtain the age-based percentile range based on the norm population. And this will indicate the child's ability among their peers, and this will also enable the examiner to understand the child's performance level. So as such, after you know the test, the raw score, you'll be able to determine if the individual has difficulties understanding and learning vocabulary. On the other hand, we also use qualitative analysis, which this analysis makes use of the items under the receptive vocabulary, which I've mentioned earlier, which includes the home and school vocabulary, the parts of common daily speech, and STEM vocabulary words. And by analyzing these words, you will know whether this individual has language disorder and therefore provide the information as to the type of intervention required. So next, Joyce will walk us through the reliability and validity of this PPVT.
Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, when using a standardized non-reference measure such as the PPVT5, the scores obtained must be reliable and valid indicators of performance in the area that the test measures. So the statistical properties provide evidence to support the test interpretations and the intended users. This results in greater confidence in treatment planning. Next slide, please. So psychometric properties that are critical to interpreting test scores includes reliability and validity. Reliability in scores is demonstrated through reliability coefficients, including internal consistency, using standard errors of measurement and confidence intervals, as well as stability, either alternate form, stability, or test retest. So the PPVT's validity is demonstrated by providing evidence based on test content, response processes, relationships with prior editions of the test and other tests that measures the same constructs, and on special group studies. But for our presentation, I will be covering on the evidence based on test content. So next slide. Reliability refers to the consistency, accuracy, and stability of test scores across repeated testing under identical situations, according to Sadler and Urbina. Although this theoretical situation can never be attained absolutely, various estimates of reliability can be obtained in practice. The difference between an individual's hypothetical true score and the obtained score is called the measurement error. A reliable test has a relatively small measurement error and provides consistent scores within and across administration. The reliability of the PPVT was evaluated using internal consistency, alternate form stability, and test retest stability. For our presentation, we'll be focusing on internal consistency and test retest stability. Next slide, please. Internal consistency is the measure of how consistently the items of the test measure one construct. So the internal consistency reliability coefficients are used to describe the homogeneity of the items in the test. For each of the forms A and B, the internal consistency of PPVT5 test scores was examined using split half reliability. So the reliability coefficients are useful for evaluating a test consistency of measurement for a group of examinees, but they are not directly applicable to the interpretation of test scores. The standard error of measurement, or SEM, provides an estimate of the amount of error in an individual's observed test score. The SEM is inversely related to the reliability of a test. So the greater the reliability, as you can see from the box in our table, the greater the reliability, the smaller the SEM, and the greater the confidence in the precision of the observed test score. So the SEM for a single score also indicates the variability expected in obtained scores around the individual's theoretical true score and the observed test scores. In other words, the SEM indicates how much an individual score may vary if he or she were repeatedly tested on the same instrument under identical circumstances. As you can see from the data displayed on the table, the split half reliability for each age range, as well as the average score at the bottom here, is excellent, so demonstrating a high degree of reliability. Next slide. So the test retest stability is the correlation between test and retest scores. To examine the test retest stability, an individual is given the exact same test twice, each under conditions that are similar as possible. He or she will not perform exactly the same way in each of the two test sessions. The time interval between the test and the retest is as short as possible to minimize changes in an individual, yet long enough for any practice or memory effects to dissipate. As the data in the table indicate, the PPVT5 test score possess good stability across time for all age groups. As you can see for the first testing, 100.9, 100.4, 91.5. The data from the mean from the second testing did not vary drastically at all. It's actually quite close. Although if you observe the standard difference, there is a higher mean retest score. as you can see from 0.08 for the first testing and a 0.32 for the second testing. However, this finding is a common occurrence that may be attributed to the examinee being familiar with the testing format and administration. Overall, results still indicate consistent performance on different testing occasions. Next slide, please. Validity refers to how accurately a method measures what it intended to measure. So the validity of a test is demonstrated by providing evidence to support the test interpretation and users. There are multiple sources of information required in the process of validating a test, each source representing a different aspect of validity. The validity of the PPVT-5 is supported by evidence based on test content, response processes, relationship with prior versions of the test, as well as other tests that measures the same constructs and special group studies. So we'll be focusing on the evidence based on test content. Next slide, please. So validity evidence related to test content is supported when the content areas being measured are accepted as relating to the proposed construct, and when the content areas measured by the test are accepted to be an adequate sampling of these areas. The content of tests used with individuals must also appropriately reflect developmental aspects of the concepts being measured. So inappropriate content, item wording, or item construction may confound the interpretation and the usefulness of the test scores. So as the PPVT-5 measures word knowledge, specifically indicated by the performance of receptive vocabulary, biases may occur if a test item references a situation that is unfamiliar to an individual from a specific cultural, ethnic, or socioeconomic group. Hence, there are concerns regarding gender biases, ethnic and cultural bias. So in addition to carefully constructing items to limit possible test bias for individuals, items were also submitted to a panel of school psychologists and speech language pathologists from across America with expertise in assessment of diverse population. The panel members reviewed the stimulus words and pictures included in the standardization research phase for the potential bias. Panel members also then appraised the administration directions, stimulus words and pictures for each item to determine if they were appropriate for individuals of either sex, from diverse ethnic backgrounds, different regions of the country, and different socioeconomic levels. So although inherent bias will be impossible to eliminate, as it is difficult to represent all identities and experiences in one country, let alone the world, it is evident that extensive efforts have been made to ensure that the test content is broadly valid. So we will move on to our reflection. For my individual assignment project, I administered the assessment on two separate individuals. So we have student A, who was 6 years, 10 months when the test was administered. The language spoken at home is predominantly Punjabi with some English. Student A came from a blue-collar family of 6 and currently under MOE FAS, the Financial Assistance Scheme. Student A, through the assessment, tested to be at the 3rd percentile of amongst her same-age American peers. Student B, Student B was 8 years, 6 months as of testing. Student B's primary language was English with some Tamil, coming from a background of a white-collared family of 4 with a stay-at-home mom. Student B tested at the 37th percentile within the expected range amongst his same-age American peers. So from the results, we can see that student A tested at it is possible that their varying test scores may be attributed to a variety of factors, such as their socioeconomic situation, exposure to different experiences, as well as media and books. So next slide. But what we care about is about the data that PPVT5 provides the assessors. So the PPVT5 assessment breaks down student responses into a few categories, namely STEM, STEM, vocabulary, home and school-related vocabulary. This gives insights to specific areas of weakness in the student's vocabulary and allows the intervention teacher to make informed decisions during lesson planning. Based on each student's relative weakness, the intervention specialist may introduce targeted vocabulary themes during the course of intervention. So in the area of literacy intervention or early intervention, the PPVT5 is usually administered with other specific assessment targeting reading and spelling as well. And together, the goal of screening is to provide a rough gauge of a child's English literacy ability and to provide the intervention specialist with a picture of a specific areas that the student needs more attention on. So targeted intervention together with comprehensive assessment will allow specialists to provide a more effective and individualized intervention service for the students who require it. So that's all from us. Thank you very much for listening.